What you're looking at isn't a movie set. This is Versailles, the most expensive palace ever built, and that man squatting in the center of the room is the most powerful person on earth. 100 nobles are watching him, competing to be there, begging for the privilege. My name is Vane, and today I'm delivering the forensic report on the biological disaster hiding beneath the gold. Because nothing about Versailles was clean, not the walls, not the skin, and definitely not the throne. Imagine waking up every morning surrounded by 100 strangers staring at you. Not as punishment, as the highest honor a human being could receive in 17th century France. This was the levee, the royal awakening ritual, and it was one of the most psychologically engineered power displays in the history of Western civilization. Every morning before Louis XIV even opened his eyes, the machinery was already in motion. Dozens of nobles had been waiting outside his chamber door since before dawn. Dukes, counts, military generals, ambassadors, all of them ranked, catalogued, and assigned a precise moment to enter. The first tier came in while the king was still in bed. The second tier arrived as he was being dressed, and a select privileged few were granted what historians of the period described as the most coveted position of all. Standing in the room while the king used the chaise percée, an ornate, cushioned chair with a hole cut into the seat, positioned directly over a removable chamber pot. Let that register for a moment. These were not servants. These were the most powerful aristocrats in Europe, men who commanded armies and controlled vast fortunes. And they were fighting, politically maneuvering, spending years of social capital just to be in that room. The French court memoirs of the Duke of Saint-Simon, who documented Versailles life in extraordinary detail across thousands of handwritten pages, describe nobles physically trembling with pride when Louis XIV spoke to them during this ritual. The king might ask a question, make a casual observation, even gesture for someone to hand him a document, all while actively using the chamber pot. And the noble on the receiving end of that interaction would recount it for weeks as a career-defining moment. This was not accidental. Louis XIV designed the levee with surgical political precision. By controlling who stood where in that room, he controlled the entire French aristocracy. If you were excluded from the inner chamber your rivals noticed, your status dropped, your influence eroded. Historian William Ritchie Newton, in his 2008 academic study on Versailles court mechanics, documented how the levee functioned as a daily dominance calibration, a live-action ranking system where proximity to the king's body was the currency of power. The closer you stood to the biological act, the higher your social standing. Excrement and prestige had been fused into a single transaction. Now consider the sensory reality of that room. Versailles in the early 18th century had no ventilation systems. The chamber was sealed, heavy tapestries, thick curtains, bodies packed shoulder to shoulder in wool and silk. The king's physician records, preserved in the French National Archives, reveal that Louis XIV suffered from severe intestinal conditions throughout his reign, including an anal fistula that required surgical intervention in 1686, a procedure so significant that French surgeons published detailed accounts of it, and courtiers reportedly celebrated his recovery in the streets of Paris. This was not a man with a quiet, dignified biological routine. The room smelled, aggressively, and not a single noble moved toward the door. Instead, they reached for their perfume vials. Versailles court etiquette demanded that nobles carry small glass bottles of scented oils, orange blossom, musk, ambergris, which they would discreetly hold beneath their nostrils during the levee. Not to show discomfort, never to show discomfort, to show that they were refined enough to be there, composed enough to endure it, loyal enough to smile through it. The biological theater was in full performance, and everyone on that stage had rehearsed their role. And here's the detail that reframes everything. This ritual was not unique to Louis. It was inherited, standardized, and replicated across the French monarchy for generations. It was the system, which means the palace that housed it had to accommodate not just one man's biological needs in a controlled setting, but the biological needs of nearly 10,000 people living within its walls. Nobles, servants, guards, courtiers, visiting dignitaries, all of them producing waste, all of them eating, sweating, and decaying inside the most architecturally celebrated building in the world. Which brings us to a question the official tour guides tend to skip entirely. Where exactly did 10,000 people go to the bathroom inside a palace with almost no bathrooms? 700 rooms, 17 gardens. Over 10,000 people living, eating, and breathing inside those walls on any given day. and by most historical accounts, fewer than a handful of designated waste facilities for the entire population. Versailles was not a palace with a sanitation problem. Versailles was the sanitation problem. The architecture of the building was designed to project divinity, not manage biology. So what happened was simple and catastrophic. People went wherever they could. French historian Mathieu d'Avignat, who serves as scientific director of the Palace of Versailles Research Center, has confirmed through period documents that courtiers routinely relieved themselves in stairwells, behind statues, inside window alcoves, and behind the heavy velvet curtains that lined the grand corridors. Chamber pots were emptied from upper floor windows into the courtyards below. In summer, the heat accelerated decomposition at a rate that made sections of the palace physically unbearable. Contemporary accounts from foreign ambassadors, including dispatches from the Spanish and English courts preserved in their respective national archives, describe the smell of Versailles as detectable before the palace was even visible on the horizon. Visitors arriving by carriage reportedly knew they were approaching by scent alone, miles before the Golden Gates came into view. And yet, inside, everyone smiled. Everyone bowed. Everyone pretended the air was fine. Because if the levee taught us anything, it's that at Versailles, biological reality was always subordinate to performance. The costume had to be maintained, even when the costume itself was slowly destroying the body underneath it. If the palace was a biological disaster on the outside, what was happening underneath the clothing was far worse. And it was entirely self-inflicted. The corset was the defining garment of Versailles, worn by women from the age of 3. Not occasionally, daily, continuously, laced so tightly that the target waist measurement for a noblewoman at the French court was approximately 13 inches. To put that in anatomical context, the average human liver alone is wider than that. Something had to move to make that number possible, and it did. Forensic skeletal analysis of remains recovered from 18th century French aristocratic burial sites, documented in studies published by French bioarchaeologists in peer-reviewed journals, shows consistent permanent rib deformation in female subjects. The lower ribs were not just compressed, they were redirected, forced inward and downward over years of continuous pressure, reshaping the entire thoracic cavity. The stomach, liver, and intestines were physically displaced from their natural positions, migrating downward and laterally to accommodate the crushing vertical force of the whalebone stays. The result was not elegance. It was a slow, systematic organ failure dressed in silk. Digestion became chronically impaired. Breathing was permanently restricted to the upper chest only. Deep breaths were anatomically impossible in full court dress. And the fainting that period paintings romanticize as feminine delicacy? That was hypoxia. Oxygen deprivation. The body shutting down non-essential functions because the lungs could not expand enough to supply adequate airflow to the brain. Noblewomen fainted at Versailles not because they were sensitive. They fainted because they were being suffocated by their own clothing every single day as a social requirement. And the moment a woman loosened her corset, even briefly, the sudden return of displaced organs caused intense cramping and nausea. The body had forgotten what normal felt like. Physicians of the period, including the royal doctor Pierre Dionys, documented cases of women who had worn corsets so long that removal caused acute pain rather than relief. The deformation had become the new baseline. This was the biological cost of being fashionable at Versailles. And if you think that was the worst thing they were putting on their bodies, you haven't seen what they were putting on their faces. The ideal face at Versailles was white, not fair, not pale. White, the color of blank parchment, of bleached bone, of something that had never seen sunlight. And achieving that look required coating the skin in a thick, dense paste that was, by every modern toxicological standard, a slow-acting poison applied directly to the face every single morning. The primary ingredient in the most popular court cosmetics of the period was a heavy metal whitener, a corrosive mineral paste refined from toxic ore that had been used in European cosmetics since the Renaissance. Ladies-in-waiting applied it in layers, building up a porcelain-like surface across the forehead, cheeks, and neck. The Venetian formulation, which was the most coveted and the most lethal, was documented by the English physician Thomas Shirley in the late 17th century as causing progressive skin deterioration with continued use. Yet demand never dropped. At Versailles, the aesthetic result outweighed every biological consequence, and the consequences were severe. Prolonged daily contact with these toxic pigments caused the skin to develop open sores, pustules, and ulcerations. the very blemishes the cosmetics were meant to conceal. So the response was logical in the most horrifying way possible. Apply another layer. Thicker, over the wounds, over the infection. The makeup became a biological seal, trapping bacteria against damaged skin, accelerating the very decay it was designed to hide. Women who had used these mineral pastes for years developed skin so compromised that contemporaries described it as tissue that had lost its fundamental structural integrity, thin, discolored, and marked by permanent scarring beneath the painted surface. Absorbed through the skin over months and years of daily application, these compounds also caused systemic poisoning. Hair loss, neurological symptoms including tremors and mood instability, and progressive damage to the kidneys and peripheral nervous system. Historians cross-referencing court physician records with cosmetic use documentation have noted a striking pattern of neurological complaints among heavily painted noblewomen that aligns precisely with what modern toxicology identifies as chronic heavy metal poisoning. And after the face was painted, the hair was built, which introduced an entirely separate ecosystem of biological horror sitting directly on top of the skull. The wigs of Versailles were not accessories, they were architecture. Towering constructions of human and animal hair, wired internal frames, and decorative elements, flowers, ribbons, miniature ships, stuffed birds, that could reach heights of 2 feet or more above the wearer's head. And the foundation holding all of it together was animal fat. Specifically rendered pork lard, applied generously to the base of the wig to fix the structure and create the powdered surface that court fashion demanded. Now apply basic thermodynamics. You have a dense mass of organic material, hair, fat, fabric, wire, sealed against a human scalp that produces heat and moisture continuously. In a palace with no climate control, in rooms packed with bodies and candles, the temperature inside a full court wig averaged significantly higher than the ambient air. What you have created, functionally, is an incubator. Warm, moist, rich in organic nutrients, sealed from light and airflow. The biological response was immediate and predictable. Lice were not an occasional problem at Versailles. They were a permanent feature of court life. Period accounts, including the letters of Elizabeth Charlotte of the Palatinate, sister-in-law to Louis XIV, describe the casual, almost ritualistic removal of lice from wigs as a daily social activity, conducted openly during court gatherings with no apparent embarrassment. Long ivory and silver scratching rods, some elaborately decorated and worn as accessories, were standard equipment for any serious courtier. They were slid beneath the wig structure to reach the scalp without disturbing the exterior architecture. Fleas colonized the same environment. And in documented cases from the period, the warmth and insulation of elaborate wig structures attracted rodents, specifically mice, seeking nesting material. French court records and satirical pamphlets of the 18th century reference women discovering mice nesting within their wigs, a detail so frequently mentioned across independent sources that historians treat it not as exaggeration, but as a genuine, recurring occupational hazard of Versailles fashion. The powder used to coat the exterior, like finely milled wheat starch or chalk, added another layer of organic material to the ecosystem, while simultaneously creating a respiratory hazard. Powdering rooms at Versailles were small enclosed spaces where servants applied the coating using bellows, generating dense clouds of particulate matter that both the servant and the wearer inhaled directly. For servants who performed this task multiple times daily across years of service, the chronic respiratory implications were significant and entirely unacknowledged. This was the biological reality sitting on top of the most expensive, most admired, most imitated fashion silhouette in the Western world. A living ecosystem of parasites and decay, lacquered in starch, accessorized with pearls. Here is the forensic verdict on Versailles. It was the most sophisticated psychological control system ever constructed, and the body was its primary battlefield. Louis XIV understood something that no military campaign could achieve: that if you control the daily physical rituals of the most powerful people in your country, you control the people themselves. So he built a palace with no privacy, no sanitation, and no escape from performance. He made proximity to biological reality a privilege. He made self-mutilation through fashion a requirement for social survival. And he made the slow poisoning of the skin the price of political relevance. The nobles of Versailles crushed their own organs, sealed their skin in toxic mineral paste, and hosted parasite colonies on their heads. Not because they were ignorant, but because the alternative was invisibility. And at Versailles, invisibility was a death sentence. They controlled empires. They signed documents that moved borders and ended wars. And they could not eat a meal without their digestive system being compressed by whalebone, could not breathe deeply without their lungs straining against reinforced fabric, and could not scratch their own heads without a specialized ivory tool. The stench of majesty was not a metaphor. It was the ambient air of the most powerful address on Earth. They ruled the world. Their own biology ruled them. Appreciate your private bathroom, seriously. If you made it to the end of this forensic report, you already know you're not a casual viewer. And this channel was built specifically for people like you. Here's why these 3 things matter. If you subscribe, the algorithm will make sure the next historical autopsy we publish lands directly in your feed. And we have cases coming that make Versailles look clean. If you comment, tell me which detail genuinely disturbed you the most, because your answers shape which cases we investigate next. Your comment is direct input into this channel's research direction, and if you like this video, you are telling the platform that serious forensic history deserves to exist alongside everything else competing for your attention. One click is a vote for content that actually respects your intelligence.